There is a land, dry and wounded, where hunger has the face of a child, where mothers whisper prayers into the dust, hoping the next sunrise brings food, not farewell. But in the heart of Burkina Faso, a storm of faith is rising. A young man, once a soldier of the soil, now carries the dreams of a nation on his shoulders. His name is Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and his fight is not for gold or power, but for bread and for dignity. They say you can't feed a nation on courage alone. He says, "Watch me." This story is not about politics, it's about purpose, about one man who refused to let his people starve while others shook hands over empty promises. If you believe Africa deserves to be heard, subscribe. Because silence has never fed a single child. Because today, we tell the story of a man who's feeding hope, one full meal at a time. There comes a time when hunger itself becomes a form of slavery, when an empty stomach is used to buy silence, and poverty becomes the chain no one can see. For decades, Burkina Faso was that kind of land, rich in soul, poor in everything else. The fields were dry, the people tired, and the promises of the powerful had turned into dust. Foreign aid came in boxes stamped with flags, not love. It fed a few mouths, but it fed dependence even more. And in the eyes of the young, hope was dying, quietly, one skipped meal at a time. Then, in the midst of despair, a young soldier began to question. Why must a proud people wait for permission to eat? Why should a child's survival depend on the pity of those who once colonized their fathers? That soldier's name was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He was not born into privilege. He did not inherit power. He rose from the red earth of Burkina Faso, shaped by hunger, by faith, by fire. He had seen soldiers starve on the front lines, while bureaucrats dined in foreign hotels. He had seen farmers grow food they could never afford to eat. And one morning, he stood before his men, young, weary, hungry, and said, "A nation that cannot feed its children cannot call itself free." Those words were not just a declaration. They were a spark. In October 2022, the world woke up to the sound of boots and drums in Ouagadougou. The flag of submission came down. A new one rose, bold, unbent, black and red with purpose. The West called it a coup. The people called it deliverance. Traoré became the youngest president in Africa, not by ambition, but by necessity. And from his first day, his message was not about war, but nourishment. He said, "Before we build roads, we must fill stomachs." That became his first mission, 100,000 full meals a day, not a slogan, not a dream, a target, a vow, a sacred act. Across the villages of Burkina Faso, giant iron pots began to boil. The smell of millet, maize, and beans filled the air again. Children lined up, barefoot, smiling for the first time in months. Each spoonful became a message. You are not forgotten. You belong. You are the future. The program spread from schools to hospitals, from cities to the most remote fields. Women volunteered to cook. Soldiers carried sacks of grain instead of rifles. It was not charity, it was defiance. Because to Traoré, every meal was a political statement. Every bowl of rice was an act of resistance. Each full belly shouted louder than any speech, "Burkina Faso will feed itself." And as his initiative grew, the world began to notice. International agencies called it unsustainable. Former allies warned of economic consequences. But the people of Burkina Faso didn't hear the warnings. They heard music, the music of dignity. Old men said they had not seen this kind of unity since Thomas Sankara walked the same streets. Mothers named their newborns Ibrahim in gratitude. Markets reopened. Children sang again. For the first time in a generation, the word independence tasted like real food. Not something written in treaties, but something you could smell, touch, and share. But beyond the laughter of children and the aroma of millet, there were eyes watching, far beyond the borders, eyes that feared not his weapons, but his example. Because a leader who can feed his people without asking for help is more dangerous to the system than 1,000 guns. And as the pots kept boiling and the bowls kept filling, rumors began to spread in the corridors of power, in Paris, in Brussels, in Washington. "Who is this young captain?" they whispered. "Who dares to break the chains we built so carefully?" And soon, the world would answer that question, not with applause, but with sanctions, fear, and fire. They say when a man feeds his people, the hungry rejoice. But when that man frees his people, the powerful tremble. It did not take long for the tremors to begin. The Western media called him a populist. The think tanks labeled him dangerous. And the diplomats, those same men who once smiled across banquet tables, began to whisper the word sanctions. Burkina Faso, they said, was turning away from democracy. But the people laughed, because for them, democracy had never brought food, nor dignity, nor peace. They remembered the words of Sankara, the revolutionary who came before. "He who feeds you controls you." And Traoré, that young captain, dared to take back control. In Europe, editorials painted him as a threat. In Africa, murals began to appear. His image, beret tilted, eyes steady, appeared on walls in Bamako, Niamey, Accra, and Dakar. The youth called him le capitaine du peuple, the people's captain. They sang his name in the streets, they wore his face on their shirts, they quoted his words in classrooms and churches. For a moment, Africa remembered herself. But the more the people believed, the louder the world protested. First came the warnings, then the withdrawals, then the threats. Burkina Faso was cut from international aid programs. Loans were frozen, ambassadors were recalled. News outlets ran stories of military oppression, yet not one mentioned the children who now ate 3 times a day. Still, Traoré stood before his people, calm, grounded, unshaken, and said, "Let them take their aid. We will plant our own seeds." That sentence echoed across a continent tired of begging. It was more than a policy. It was a prayer. And in church halls in Atlanta, Detroit, and New Orleans, the elders of the African diaspora began to nod. They saw in him the same fire that had burned in their ancestors, from the cotton fields to the civil rights marches. A man who did not ask for permission to stand tall. On social media, thousands shared his speeches, subtitled in English. Clips of Traoré shaking hands with farmers, feeding orphans, standing bareheaded in the rain. They went viral not because of their style, but because of their spirit. He was a young man leading not with fear, but with faith. And faith is contagious. Even in America, the old and the young began to talk. "Who is this man from Burkina Faso?" they asked. "He reminds me of what leadership used to mean." Across Africa, something was shifting. Mali, Niger, Guinea, each nation, tired of dependence, began to echo the same cry. We are done kneeling, and the Western world, the same world that had once divided Africa with maps and treaties, now faced an Africa united not by money, but by dignity. For the first time in a century, the narrative was changing. The children of the colonized were writing their own story, and the pen was no longer for sale. Yet, power never yields without resistance. Behind closed doors, meetings were held, statements drafted, accusations whispered. They said Traoré was a puppet of Moscow. They said he was too young, too radical, too unpredictable. They said he was playing with fire. But what they feared most was not his alliances. It was his example. A leader who could feed his nation without a single Western coin was proof that the system could be broken. And so the pressure mounted. Economic isolation, media disinformation, political sabotage. But instead of breaking, Burkina Faso began to bloom. The farmers doubled their harvests, local industries reopened, and while the headlines screamed chaos, the streets were singing freedom. "We are hungry no more," they cried. "We are fed, and we are free." That was the true revolution, not in the palaces of power, but in the pots of the poor, not in the speeches of diplomats, but in the smiles of children. And as the fire of self-reliance spread from village to village, a new fear gripped the old world, because Africa was waking up, and this time she would not go back to sleep. But revolutions, no matter how righteous, always come with a price, and soon Captain Traoré would face his greatest test yet. Freedom is never free. It costs comfort, convenience, and sometimes even friends. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the cost came swiftly. Foreign aid disappeared overnight. International partners withdrew. Projects promised under glossy banners were quietly cancelled. But the fields did not stop growing. The rivers did not stop flowing. And the people, they did not stop believing. Burkina Faso entered what the newspapers called a season of scarcity, but those who lived it called it a season of awakening. In the markets of Ouagadougou, traders began to sell what they made with their own hands. In the farmlands, new cooperatives were formed, where men and women worked side by side. No one waited for imports. They planted, harvested, and shared. Children who once begged for rice were now helping serve it. Schools became kitchens, churches became storage houses, soldiers became builders. And through it all, Traoré walked among them, not as a ruler, but as a brother. He ate from the same bowl, drank from the same cup, slept in the same dust. His voice carried not commands, but conviction. "We may be poor today," he told them, "but we are not for sale." Those words spread faster than any rumor. They became the heartbeat of a people rediscovering their pride. The West mocked him for his simplicity. But in the villages, simplicity was survival. The people began to see wealth not in currency, but in unity. One old farmer, his hands rough and brown from decades of soil, said to a journalist, "Before, they gave us aid and called it help. Now, we feed ourselves and call it freedom." That was the real revolution, quiet, humble, unstoppable. Yet the world did not clap for this kind of success. There were no headlines celebrating the fall of hunger, no front-page stories about children laughing again. Because dignity doesn't sell. Dependency does. Still, the transformation continued. Villages once forgotten by maps began to light up at night, not with electricity, but with song. Women who once walked miles for food now organized meal cooperatives, and the phrase 100,000 full meals a day became more than a number. It became a testimony, a sermon written in sweat and hope. But even as the people rejoiced, dark clouds gathered. Whispers of coup attempts, threats from neighboring elites, and economic isolation weighed heavy on the nation. The question lingered. How long could one young captain stand against the tide of global pressure? Inside his modest office, Traoré faced choices no man should face alone. Stay firm and risk everything, or bend and lose his soul. And through sleepless nights, one thought echoed in his mind: the faces of the children he had fed. Their laughter was the answer to every doubt. Because once you've seen a hungry child smile, you can never return to indifference. He knew, if he gave up now, he would betray more than a dream. He would betray the ancestors who had died for freedom and the unborn who would depend on it. So he chose to stay, to endure, to walk the long road of integrity. And across the world, the diaspora began to rise in solidarity. In Harlem, in Lagos, in Accra, in London, voices began to chant the same words: "Feed your people, free your people." It became not just Burkina Faso's cry, but Africa's prayer. And for the first time in a long time, the world began to see what happens when a nation stops asking and starts becoming. But can dignity alone sustain a nation? Or will the world, once again, punish a people simply for standing tall? Do you believe Africa can ever be truly independent, economically and spiritually? Far away from the red earth of Burkina Faso, in the heart of America, something began to stir. In church halls in Atlanta, in barbershops in Detroit, in small cafes in Harlem, the name Traoré started to echo. Not through headlines, but through whispers, through sermons and songs, through the quiet pride of elders who had marched for freedom once before. They looked at this young man, a soldier with no suit, no sponsors, no permission, and they saw something they hadn't seen in years: conviction. To many in the African diaspora, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was more than a political leader. He was a reflection, a reminder of who they once were and who they could still be. In the eyes of grandmothers who remembered segregation, in the prayers of fathers who once marched beside Dr. King, Traoré became a living sermon. "He's the kind of man," one preacher said from his pulpit in Chicago, "that doesn't just lead, he restores belief." News outlets in the West showed skepticism. They called him radical, untested, anti-Western. But in the pews and homes of Black America, people weren't listening to the pundits. They were listening to their spirits, because they recognized that tone of defiance, the same one that had built movements, the same one that had faced fire hoses, prisons, and lynching trees. It was the voice of dignity speaking again through a new generation. Across the Atlantic, the youth of Africa rose in celebration, and in the West, the elders of the diaspora rose in prayer. The two ends of a long, broken bridge began to meet again. For decades, the story of Africa had been told by others. But now, the descendants of the enslaved and the colonized were listening to each other. And when they heard Traoré say, "We will build with what we have," they nodded, because they understood. It was not just a message for Burkina Faso. It was a prophecy for every people ever told they were not enough. Even in Europe, young Africans began to lift their heads. In Paris, students chanted his name outside embassies. In London, young men wore T-shirts that read, "Africa is not poor, she is plundered." Something sacred was happening. Not political, but spiritual. A rebirth of faith in Black leadership, Black unity, Black self-worth. And for the first time in centuries, the West was not just watching Africa, it was learning from her. But revolutions of the spirit must walk through fire, and for Traoré, the flames were only just beginning to rise. Every revolution reaches a point when the songs fade and the struggle begins. The easy victories have been won. The hard ones lie ahead. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the road ahead is not paved with applause. It is carved through sacrifice, solitude, and sleepless nights. He knows that the same powers who once drew borders on African soil now draw lines through African dreams. He knows that the same hands that offer aid also hold the leash. And yet, he walks on. Because true freedom isn't a flag you raise once, it's a field you must tend every day. Burkina Faso stands at the crossroads of destiny, one path lined with pressure and temptation, the other with hunger and hardship. But Traoré has chosen the harder road, the one that leads to dignity, not comfort. He is rebuilding not just an economy, but a spirit, a belief that Africa can stand, feed, and lead herself. Factories are rising where foreign bases once stood. Farmers are plowing with purpose, not for export, but for existence. The youth are working, not fleeing. The anthem of a new Africa is being written, not in ink, but in action. And yet, he is not naive. He knows history. He knows what happened to those who came before: Lumumba, Sankara, Nkrumah, Cabral, men who dreamed too loudly and were silenced too soon. But fear is a luxury he cannot afford, because as long as a single child still goes to bed hungry, his mission remains unfinished. That is his calling. That is his Ibrahim Traoré achievement, not wealth, not fame, but endurance. He once said to a crowd of young soldiers, "If I fall, don't mourn for me. Pick up the flag and keep feeding our children." Those words were not just courage, they were covenant. A promise between a leader and his people, between a continent and her sons. And across Africa, that promise has become a seed. In Mali, in Niger, in Chad, in Ghana, men and women are beginning to whisper, "If Burkina Faso can rise, so can we." That is the true victory, not just to resist, but to inspire. To show that the power of a meal, the strength of a seed, and the courage of one young captain can shake empires more than any army ever could. The world watches now, half in doubt, half in awe. Because if Traoré succeeds, the old order will never look the same again. And as the sun sets over the red soil of Burkina Faso, one question burns brighter than all. Can hope survive the weight of history? There are moments in history when one man's courage becomes a continent's prayer. Burkina Faso has given us such a man. His name is Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He has no crown, no empire, no foreign blessing, and yet he carries the weight of millions, not with pride, but with purpose. He has shown us that leadership is not a title, it is a testimony. That true power is not in wealth, but in the will to feed your people when the world turns its back. In every full bowl of millet, in every smiling child, in every field sown with the hands of the poor, there lies the echo of his promise. We will feed ourselves. We will free ourselves. And that, my brothers and sisters, is not just an Ibrahim Traoré achievement. It is the rebirth of African dignity. He reminds us that freedom has a flavor, the taste of food grown on one's own soil. He reminds us that hope has a sound, the laughter of children who no longer cry from hunger. And he reminds us that sovereignty is not a speech. It is a meal served with pride, not pity. For centuries, Africa has been told to wait. Wait for aid, wait for permission, wait for respect. But tonight, as the fires burn across the plains of Burkina Faso, we hear a new word rising. Not wait, but rise. Rise to feed your people. Rise to reclaim your name. Rise to prove that our ancestors did not suffer in vain. If you believe in this rising, share this story. If you believe Africa deserves dignity, subscribe and let the world hear your voice. Because silence has never saved a soul. Tell me in the comments. Do you believe the world is ready for leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré? Or will history once again fear the strength of an Africa that stands tall? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. The flame has been lit. And as long as there are hearts that still believe, the fire of Africa's freedom will never die.